Attorney Collins' office sat in an old wooden building at the end of a quiet street. The warm yellow lights cast a soft glow over the worn, reddish-brown carpet, creating a feeling that was both formal and distant. In that space, Eleanor's footsteps sounded light but distinct. She carried a navy blue file folder so old that its edges were frayed. Her hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because she knew today would not be easy. Even so, her eyes remained calm, bright, and alert. When she approached the long table, Mason and Finn were already standing in front of the only empty chair. They stood close together, straight-backed, as if guarding something that did not belong to them. Mason spoke first, his tone flat and blunt without the slightest hesitation. "You're not in the will. This meeting is for real family." Finn didn't look at her. He lowered his head, avoiding his mother's eyes, yet he also didn't move to let her pass. The room fell silent instantly. No one spoke. Even the hum of the air conditioner sounded more distant. Eleanor set her bag down on the bench by the wall. The movement was gentle but resolute. She looked directly at the two sons she had raised, and she felt with striking clarity that she was being treated like a stranger. A question rose in her mind, painful and straightforward. Why do my sons see me as an outsider? No one answered. There were only Mason's stern gaze and Finn's inexplicable silence. If you've ever seen a family fracture over a single piece of paper, stay with me. Stories like this remind us of the actual value of family bonds. Subscribe so you won't miss the next part of this journey. Eleanor stood still for a few seconds after Mason's harsh words. She didn't argue. She simply opened her bag and pulled out an ivory-colored invitation card stamped with the Collins Law Office seal in the top left corner. She handed it to Mason, placing it in his hand with an almost unnerving calm. "An official invitation," she said, her voice steady and soft. "Addressed to me." Mason glanced at it, but his expression didn't change. Perhaps he assumed it was just a system error or a clerical mistake. But Eleanor knew better than anyone. What she brought today wasn't a piece of paper to flaunt. It was a truth her two sons never expected. The receptionist behind the front desk looked at Eleanor with confusion. She checked the list once, then rechecked it. Her finger ran down the neatly printed names, but Eleanor's wasn't there. "I don't see your name on the list," she said quietly. "There might be a mistake, but according to the schedule, today is only for Aunt Livia's family meeting." Eleanor showed no surprise. She simply nodded, then took a thick envelope from the navy file folder, clipped tightly with old metal fasteners. She placed the envelope on the counter, gently sliding it toward the receptionist. "Please bring this to Mr. Collins," Eleanor said. "It's important." Her voice wasn't loud or sharp, but it carried weight. The receptionist accepted it, a bit flustered, then hurried into the back room. The wooden door closed, its hinges echoing in the quiet air. Mason turned to Finn, exchanging a quick glance. Not outright worry, but for the first time that morning, Mason's confidence slipped. His hand tightened slightly on the edge of his jacket. A tiny movement, but Eleanor noticed. Finn kept his eyes on the floor, as if trying to avoid the situation that was beginning to spiral out of their control. While waiting, Eleanor gently pulled out the chair her sons had been blocking. Neither of them stopped her. She sat down, placed the navy folder on her lap, and intertwined her fingers. There was no trembling now, only a different kind of calm, clear and firm. The room was silent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but no one spoke. Mason stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the door the receptionist had gone through. Finn remained in place, trying to appear composed, though the unease on his face was evident. 1 minute, then 2 minutes. Mason's brows tightened slightly. For the first time that day, he was no longer in control. The woman he thought he could push aside was unsettling him with nothing but her silence. The inner door suddenly opened. Attorney Collins appeared. Without looking at anyone else, he walked straight toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said, "I need to speak with you privately." In that moment, the confidence in Mason's eyes flickered. Not much, but enough for Eleanor to see. She stood, smoothed her blouse, and followed Collins into the inner office. She didn't look back at her sons. Only their silence remained behind her, and for the first time, Eleanor knew the balance of power had begun to shift. Collins led Eleanor down the narrow hallway that opened into his office. The wooden door closed behind them, shutting out the anxious whispers outside. The room was small, tidy, and organized. On the desk were neatly stacked files, and beside them a desk clock ticked steadily, giving the space a sense of calm without heaviness. "Have a seat," Collins said. Eleanor sat in the chair across from him. She opened the navy file folder, took out the thick envelope she had given the receptionist, and placed it in front of him. "There will be many things to clarify today," she said, her voice slow but firm. Collins nodded, put on his glasses, and opened the envelope. He flipped through the pages, reading each line closely. Within the first few seconds, the color on his face changed. Not simple surprise, but recognition of the document's significance. He laid the first page on the desk and tapped it lightly with his fingertips. "This is the 2009 joint will?" he asked. "That's right," Eleanor answered. "Aunt Livia and I signed it together. 2 witnesses, a notary public. Everything is included." Collins moved to the next page. The signatures were old but crisp, lined neatly across the paper. The round stamp from the notary's office sat in the right corner, clear and valid. He needed no extra time to understand the weight of the document. "This designates you as the sole heir," Collins said slowly. "All assets, including the house, the land, the investments, everything goes to you." Eleanor nodded slightly. Collins continued, "As for the amendment Mason submitted," he paused, then looked up at her. "It has no legal effect. A joint will cannot be overridden without direct consent from both signers, and Aunt Livia never revoked or modified the 2009 document." He removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "To put it plainly," Collins went on, "your 2 sons have no legal claim to Aunt Livia's estate. When the meeting begins, all I need to do is read these pages, and everything will be clear." Eleanor clasped her hands together. She felt neither triumphant nor afraid. What settled in her chest was a mix of relief and a quiet sadness. She knew this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel this calm. Collins asked, "Do you want me to explain it to them privately before the formal reading? If you want to avoid conflict, I can—" "No," Eleanor cut in gently but firmly. "I want them to hear it in front of everyone." Collins straightened his back and studied her for a moment, as if weighing the force of her words. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Eleanor said. "What needs to be clear should be clear from the beginning. And I don't want to repeat this again." Collins closed the file and stood up. "All right, we'll return to the conference room." Eleanor rose with him. As her hand rested on the doorknob, she felt it unmistakably. This was the turning point. Not to claim something, but to return everything to its rightful place. On the other side of the door, everything was waiting. When Collins opened the door and stepped out, every gaze in the conference room shifted toward him. The wooden door closed behind Eleanor, and the atmosphere tightened a notch. The chair Mason and Finn had blocked earlier was now unguarded. Eleanor walked to it, pulled it out, and sat down as if it had always been meant for her. Mason stood across from her, arms crossed, his face trying to stay composed, though his breathing betrayed him. Finn stared at the floor, as if trying to avoid everyone's eyes in the room. Collins placed the stack of documents on the table. It wasn't thick, but it was enough to change the entire atmosphere of the small room. He spoke clearly, without dragging or rushing his words. "We will begin reading the last legally valid will of Mrs. Livia Sutton, signed on March 10th, 2009. A slight sound came from Mason's direction, like someone had stepped on a stair that wasn't there. He tried to straighten himself, but Collins' eyes never left him. Collins continued, In this joint will, Mrs. Livia Sutton designated one sole heir to her entire estate, including the house, the land, the investment accounts, and the savings. Finn swallowed. His hands resting in front of his thighs tightened slightly. Collins turned to the final page and read each word slowly. Sole heir, Mrs. Cream, Eleanor Hart. Mason's face drained of color. It changed so visibly that it was as though someone had pulled the blood from beneath his skin. He didn't speak, but his eyes darted around for any argument against something that couldn't be argued. Finn lowered his head further, not out of shock, but because something inside him had felt wrong from the very beginning. Only now did he realize just how wrong he had been. Collins paused for a few seconds, letting everyone grasp the meaning. The silence in the room thickened, no one spoke, no chair moved. Only the soft rustle of Collins turning a page broke the air. The amendment the two of you submitted recently, Collins said evenly, has no legal validity. It cannot replace the original document because it does not meet the requirement of mutual consent in a joint will. He looked at Mason, then at Finn. If you have questions, we can discuss them after the meeting, but legally the matter is settled. Eleanor sat still, her back straight. She didn't smile or show joy, yet her eyes held a clarity and calm she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the feeling of winning, it was the feeling of receiving back the respect she should never have lost. No one spoke. The conference room was so silent that the sound of Collins slipping the documents back into the folder felt loud. And at that moment, Eleanor knew the balance had shifted. She was no longer the one being pushed aside or assumed to be irrelevant. She was the one holding the authority. The room stayed silent, but this silence belonged to her. When Eleanor opened the door and stepped into the house, the familiar space greeted her with a cold stillness. The dark kitchen was lit only by the small lamp above the sink, its flickering glow clinging to the old wall as if it were struggling to stay alive. She hung her coat on the hook and stood still for a few seconds, letting her breathing settle after a meeting heavy with emotion. She switched on the kettle. The steady sound of the water heating brought back the routine she had followed for years. Brew a cup of peppermint tea to calm herself as soon as she got home. The soft scent filled the air, bringing a quiet, old-fashioned warmth with it. As she waited for the water to boil, old memories resurfaced. Not in a rush, but piece by piece, clear and real. She remembered Daniel, her husband, a quiet man with a gentle smile. He died too soon, a sudden heart attack one winter. She only remembered standing on the porch with snow still stuck to her slippers, clutching her phone and not knowing who to call first. Mason had been 23 then. Finn is even younger. They grieved for a week, and then they began discussing cars, bills, and insurance. Everything shifted to practicality very quickly. She guessed that was how they coped. Still, sometimes she wished they had paused just a little longer. The kettle let out a short whistle. Eleanor poured the water into the teapot, and her fingers brushed the handle lightly. Even a small gesture brought her back to the time when Aunt Livia moved in years ago. Livia had been strong, cheerful, always carrying stories with her. But when the illness began, she changed. At first, it was just forgetting keys or putting a spoon in the wrong drawer. Then she forgot appointments, meals, and even conversations from a few minutes earlier. Eleanor cared for Livia from the earliest symptoms until the illness grew severe. Every appointment, every sleepless night, every moment Livia lost her bearings and mistook relatives for neighbors. Eleanor couldn't remember how many times she had to soothe her. She only remembered that she never once raised her voice to her. And Mason and Finn? They rarely visited. Sometimes too busy. Sometimes saying it made more sense for their mother to handle everything because she had more time. Busy or not, Eleanor never blamed them. But tonight, looking back, she felt the gap clearly between what she had given the family and what she had received in return. Eleanor carried her tea to the dining table. The wooden chair creaked softly as she sat, a sound so familiar it felt like part of the home itself, part of the life she had built over so many years. She took a sip. The warm liquid slid down her throat and into her chest, steadying her. Her sadness did not surge. It came slowly, like a soft breeze passing through memories. She felt no bitterness, only regret for what could have been different. But today's meeting made one thing clear. The time for waiting was over. From now on, she would decide for herself, not out of revenge, but to preserve the last pieces of kindness for her own sake. Outside, the sky had grown completely dark. Inside, the kitchen light still flickered patiently, bright enough for Eleanor to know she had not fallen. She was simply stepping into another chapter, quieter but clearer. The next morning, the house was as silent as the night before. No messages, no calls from Mason or Finn. Eleanor wasn't surprised. She had grown used to that silence over the years, except today, it no longer made her feel small. She made a cup of black coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the thin sunlight brush across the sink. The familiar emptiness was still there, but it was now mixed with a new sense of steadiness. It felt like clearing out old clutter to make space for herself again. She picked up her phone and dialed Collins. He answered immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. I'm preparing yesterday's documents. Everything remains exactly as we discussed." Eleanor didn't circle around anything. "Mr. Collins," she said clearly, "I want all the assets transferred into my name as soon as possible, and I want legal locks put in place so neither of my sons has access to anything." There was a brief silence on the other end before Collins replied, serious and composed. "We can do that. Do you want me to draft clauses restricting their power of attorney and access to any accounts?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I want everything clear." The answer wasn't just for Collins. It was for herself, proof she had stepped out of the role of enduring everything. After the call ended, Eleanor remained at the table longer than usual. But this time she didn't sink into memories. Instead, she thought of Harper, the young niece who visited her every 2 weeks, bringing homemade pastries and small stories from her life. Harper had never asked about money, never walked into Eleanor's home wanting anything except to check how she was doing. Her presence was light, but sincere, warming something inside Eleanor she thought had faded. In the afternoon, she went to Collins's office. He had prepared the files. "I also want to create a trust," Eleanor said as she pulled out the chair. "I want to set aside part of the estate for Harper. She's been genuinely good to me, and she's never asked for anything." Collins nodded, unsurprised. "We'll set up a protected trust. That portion of the assets will be secured, and no one will be able to interfere." Eleanor looked at the papers in front of her. They no longer frightened her. They were a way for her to stand up after years of enduring quietly. When she signed the first document, her hand didn't tremble. She wrote her name clearly and firmly, as if confirming to herself that her life, from now on, would be ruled by her own decisions. Collins gathered the papers and looked at her with respect. "Today, you did something many people take years to find the courage for," he said. Eleanor smiled softly. Not a happy smile, more the smile of someone who had finally found an honest path for herself. She stood, picked up the navy file folder, and walked toward the door. This time, she didn't carry it as a shield. She carried it as proof that she had reclaimed her own authority after far too many years of giving it away. 2 days after meeting with Collins, Eleanor stepped onto the porch to retrieve the newspaper when she saw a thick envelope lying on the doorstep. The paper was glossy white with pale gold trim, the kind used by large, expensive law firms. Her name was printed clearly on the front. Above it was the logo of a well-known firm in the city center. One look was enough for her to know exactly who was behind this. She brought the envelope inside, set it on the kitchen table, made herself a cup of peppermint tea, and only then slowly opened it. Inside were multiple pages filled with printed text. On the very first page, she saw Mason's name. The second page stated clearly what Mason was asking the court to review. At the time of signing the 2009 will, Mrs. Livia Sutton may have been suffering from severe cognitive impairment. In short, Mason was trying to prove that Aunt Livia was no longer mentally competent when she signed the document, and if that were true, the joint will would be invalid. Eleanor set the stack of papers on the table. She wasn't angry. She felt only a simple weariness, as if she had seen this coming from a great distance long before it happened. She stood, walked into the bedroom, opened the old wooden wardrobe, and pulled a fireproof box from the bottom drawer. She had kept it for years, only opening it when absolutely necessary. There wasn't much inside. A few documents, some photographs, and a brown journal belonging to Aunt Livia. The journal still carried the faint scent of old ink. When Eleanor opened it, each handwritten page appeared clearly. Neat penmanship, coherent sentences. There were no signs of confusion, nothing resembling the mental decline Mason was trying to fabricate. There were entries where Livia wrote about her illness, including days when she felt more tired and days when she forgot a few small things. But nothing shows disorientation, certainly nothing suggesting legal incapacity. There were even entries about the will itself. We agreed to sign a joint will to avoid complications later. I believe it's the best way to protect both of us. Eleanor carefully placed the journal into the Navy file folder. She felt no bitterness, only the sadness of a mother who understood all too well what her son was afraid of. Mason didn't just want the inheritance. He feared that if the story spread, his reputation in the financial world would suffer. His career was built on an image of precision, success, and control. He could not bear the idea of failing in front of his own mother. That afternoon, Eleanor went to Colin's office. He looked through the journal, flipped a few pages, and nodded immediately. "These entries are very strong," he said. "Clear, detailed. They don't just support the will, they completely undermine the argument Mason is trying to build." Eleanor sat quietly, her hands intertwined. "I just want everything to be resolved correctly," she said. "No more, no less." Collins handed her a prepared packet of documents. "We'll file the response today. Mason can make noise, but he can't change the truth." Eleanor left the office with steps that were light but firm. She didn't want a war, but she wasn't afraid of one anymore. From here on, if Mason wanted to escalate, he would have to face the consequences himself. He could no longer rely on his mother's silence. Later that afternoon, Eleanor was watering the small flower pots on her porch when she heard a car stop at the gate. She didn't need to look closely. She knew it was Finn's truck. The old engine with its slightly raspy sound was unmistakable. Finn walked up the steps with his familiar posture, shoulders slightly hunched, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his clothes still marked with a few dark grease stains from the garage. He looked like he had just come from a long day, but his eyes carried an unusual tension. "Hi, Mom," Finn said, voice low. Eleanor nodded slightly. "Come in, son." He didn't move right away. After a moment of hesitation, Finn reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, navy blue, worn at the edges. He placed it in her hand. "Take a look," Finn said. "I wrote down everything you've ever lent me, from the beginning." Eleanor opened it. Each page listed an amount: $300 for his first set of tools, when $200 when the garage had an accident, $50 to cover a tow fee, and many other small sums she had long forgotten. Finn wrote the numbers neatly and simply. No pleading, no excuses, just straightforward entries. "I don't know when I'll pay it all back," Finn said, "but I want to start." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She knew Finn wasn't perfect, not always responsible, but he had never tried to deceive her. He just depended on her too much. Yet today, standing on the porch, he seemed different. Not evasive, not confused, just a man trying to make things right. Eleanor closed the notebook gently, holding it in her palm. "Finn," she said softly, "if you really want to do the right thing, Don't stand with Mason." Finn looked up. His eyes held no defiance, no defensiveness, only sadness and a hint of shame. "Mason told me not to get involved," Finn said quietly. "He said I don't understand the law, and that you shouldn't get involved either. But after that day, I just couldn't stand still anymore." Eleanor studied her son's face. He was grown, but he still had the gentle look of the boy who used to sit under the car for hours learning how to remove a bolt properly. "You don't need to take sides," Eleanor said. "Just don't go against the truth." Finn was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "I won't take part in the lawsuit," he said, "and I'll tell Mason that." Eleanor exhaled lightly. Not complete relief, but enough to feel she wasn't entirely alone. Finn picked up his car key, turning it between his fingers before saying, "I'm not good with complicated things, but I know you're not wrong. And I don't want you to fight this alone." Eleanor didn't hug him. She only placed her hand briefly on his arm, a small gesture, but enough. "Go home," she said. "Thank you for coming." Finn nodded again. As he stepped off the porch and returned to his truck, Eleanor watched him go. There was neither overwhelming sadness nor evident joy, just a quiet stillness. For the first time in years, Finn had chosen a path for himself, not one pulled by Mason, not one shaped by fear of disappointing someone. And for Eleanor, that was already a meaningful shift. That afternoon, Eleanor was folding laundry in the living room when she heard the screech of brakes at the front gate. A familiar sound, but not a pleasant one. She stepped to the window and saw Mason standing beside his polished sedan. No phone call, no appointment, no warning. Mason walked up the steps with a confidence far weaker than it had been on the day of the will reading. His shirt wasn't as crisp as it usually was. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it the entire drive over. Eleanor opened the door, but only a narrow crack. "Mom," Mason said first, his voice lower than usual, "I need to talk." Eleanor stood upright, neither avoiding him nor inviting him inside. She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her. They stood only a few steps apart, yet the distance between them felt far greater. "I don't want to drag this out," Eleanor said softly. "I know," Mason replied, rubbing his forehead, "but I need to explain." Eleanor stayed quiet, letting him speak for himself. Mason inhaled deeply. "Do you think I did all of this just for money? It's not that. I'm scared of everything slipping out of my hands. I worked for years to build my career. If people find out our family is a mess, then—" Eleanor cut him off, her tone calm but precise. "You're not afraid of losing, Mason. You're afraid of not winning." Mason froze. For a brief moment, his eyes revealed the confusion he had been hiding. "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I just want everything in order. I want things the way they're supposed to be." "The way they're supposed to be according to you?" Eleanor asked. Mason bit his lip, an old childhood habit whenever he felt cornered. "Mom, I never meant to treat you like an outsider. I thought you didn't need to get involved in all that paperwork. I thought it would be better if I handled it." Eleanor looked straight at him. "Better for whom?" A breeze moved softly across the porch. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Mason released a sentence that was almost a confession. "You don't understand my world. In my field, people don't respect weakness. If they see all this, I'll lose standing. Lose clients. I tried to reorganize the will to keep things clean. I didn't think you would dare keep what's rightfully mine," Eleanor said quietly. Mason swallowed. He braced himself against the porch railing, head lowered. "You're used to winning," Eleanor continued. "Your whole life you believed that if you wanted something, everything would bend your way. And I stayed silent for so long that you thought that was normal." Mason didn't respond, but his shoulders trembled slightly. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke the truth. "You might lose the inheritance, Mason, but you're losing your mother in another way, and that, you'll have to take responsibility for. Mason lifted his gaze. His eyes were tight with tension, almost pleading, but he couldn't seem to form the words. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he asked only one thing. "So, what are we now?" Eleanor answered slowly. "We're two people who need to take a hard look at ourselves, where you stand, where I stand, and where the boundaries are." There was no hug, no tears, only a truth spoken aloud. Mason stepped back, then turned toward the stairs. When he drove off, the sound of the car door shutting echoed sharply, like a small ending being placed down. Eleanor stood on the porch for a long time, watching the car disappear. She didn't feel relieved, but she no longer felt as heavy as before. The line between mother and son had shifted, and this time it could not return to what it once was. On the morning of the hearing, a light fog hung over the sky. Eleanor arrived nearly 10 minutes early. She stood in the hallway on the second floor, clutching her familiar Navy file folder. Collins approached from the far end and greeted her with a steady nod. "Doing all right, Eleanor?" "I am," she replied. And this time, it was true. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. Rows of dark wooden benches were evenly arranged, and the white overhead lights shone directly onto the judge's bench. The room felt slightly cold but not unwelcoming. Mason was already there. He sat at the opposite table, his back straight, but his hands clenched together. The confident posture he carried in offices and high-end meetings was gone. Today he looked less like a man seeking justice and more like someone trying not to unravel. The judge was a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and sharp, impartial eyes. She opened the file, skimmed a few pages, then looked at Mason. "Mr. Mason Sutton, please state the reason for your petition to invalidate the 2009 will." Mason stood. His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to keep it steady. "Your Honor, my aunt, Mrs. Livia Sutton, was mentally impaired when she signed the will. Her condition at the time made it difficult for her to make important decisions. I believe the will needs to be reconsidered." The judge asked, "Do you have any evidence to support this claim?" Mason opened his mouth, but only a faint "I" escaped before he stopped. Clearly, he had come with nothing but words. The judge turned to Collins. "Attorney Collins?" Collins rose calmly and placed 3 sets of documents on the bench. "Your Honor, we submit Mrs. Livia's handwritten journal from the entirety of 2009, a medical certificate from her attending physician confirming full cognitive capacity, photographs and receipts from the notary office documenting the will signing process." He pushed each packet forward, precise and measured. The judge opened the journal first. She skimmed several pages. The handwriting was clear, the sentences were coherent, and the entries were accurately dated. There were no signs of confusion or disorientation. She reviewed the medical documents, then looked directly at Mason. "Do you have any response?" Mason stood motionless. His jaw twitched, as though he wanted to speak but could find no argument that could stand. "No, Your Honor." In that moment, Eleanor looked at her son. There was no sense of victory in her eyes, only sadness and a quiet fatigue. The judge placed the file down. The court finds no legal basis for the petition. The submitted documents show that Mrs. Livia was fully competent at the time the will was signed. The 2009 will remains valid. The petition for invalidation is denied. A single firm tap of the gavel echoed through the room. Collins leaned toward Eleanor and whispered, "It's done." Mason gathered his papers without looking at anyone. At the doorway, he muttered softly, more to himself than to them, "All right. That's it." Eleanor watched his figure leave the courtroom. He walked quickly but heavily, like someone who knew he had lost more than a case. She didn't follow him. She stood quietly for a few more seconds, taking a slow breath. A long chapter had closed, not with noise, not with celebration, just with the soft sound of a door gently shut. "Doi jai laban dish tieng an, mai chin ksak, jai ju kong them bot." Evening settled slowly. The last light of day streamed into the living room, revealing a thin layer of dust on the bookshelf Eleanor always forgot to wipe. She was preparing hot water when she heard a familiar knock at the door. 3 soft, even slightly timid taps. Eleanor opened the door. Harper stood there wearing an old cream-colored sweater, holding a box of cookies tied with a red string. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes bright with the gentle concern that always sat plainly on her face. "I brought freshly baked cookies," Harper said, her voice soft, as if afraid of disturbing anyone. "Come in," Eleanor replied, her lips lifting into a small, genuine smile. Harper stepped inside, set the cookie box on the table, then sat in the chair near the window, the exact place she always chose. Eleanor poured tea into 2 small porcelain cups and handed one to Harper. They sat quietly for a few seconds, listening only to the rustle of leaves in the yard. "I heard about the hearing," Harper said. "I'm glad everything's settled." Eleanor nodded. It was time for it to end. Harper didn't ask anything more. She always knew where to stop, never pushing people into feelings they weren't ready to speak about. That was what Eleanor valued most in her. "Harper," Eleanor said after a pause, "I asked you to come today not just for tea." Harper tilted her head, waiting. Eleanor stood, walked to the small wooden cabinet by the window, and took out a pale yellow envelope. She placed it in front of Harper. "Open it," Eleanor said. Harper opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a few neatly arranged legal documents. She read only the first few lines before looking up, eyes wide. You're leaving your assets to me?" Eleanor rested her hand on the table, steadying herself. "Just a portion. The rest will go to the places Livia wanted to support. But this part, I want to leave for you." Harper shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't accept this. I didn't do anything big." "You don't have to do anything big," Eleanor said slowly. "You just have to keep doing what you've already done these past years, visiting, listening, being here as if it were the most natural thing." Harper lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening gently around the edge of the letter. "But why me?" Eleanor answered, her voice soft but steady. "Because you came when no one else did. Because you treat me like someone to talk to, not someone to take from. Because you remind me that in a family, the truest thing isn't blood, it's sincerity." Harper swallowed. Her eyes shimmered but didn't spill. She held Eleanor's hand, her grip slightly trembling. "You mean more than you realize," she whispered. "And you deserve this," Eleanor said. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're genuine." They sat quietly, drinking tea. Nothing grand, just an ordinary afternoon with 2 people sharing the same peaceful space. Harper looked out toward the yard. "Ms. Eleanor, will your family be all right?" "In time," Eleanor replied. "But family isn't only the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who walk into your life at the right moment and stay." Harper smiled, holding Eleanor's hand a little longer. In that moment, Eleanor felt warmth spread through her, not from the sun, not from the tea, but from the sincere presence she had been missing for too long. The next morning, Eleanor stepped onto the porch. The weather was mild, a light breeze passing through the maple trees in the yard. Red leaves drifted down one by one, slow, sparse, as if the seasons were changing without announcement. She sat in the old wooden chair Daniel had repaired years ago. Leaning back against it, she let out a long breath. Not the sigh of someone tired, but the exhale of a person finally setting down a weight carried far too long. In the past weeks, from the day she walked into Colin's office to the hearing the day before, Eleanor had gone through feelings she never imagined she would face. Unsteady moments, sorrow, and even moments that chilled her when she saw her own son standing across from her in court. But now, in this quiet morning, she felt something very clearly. She had stood up for herself, and she was right to do so. No one could take away her self-respect anymore. No more silence for the sake of a false peace. No more yielding until she disappeared inside her own family. From the street came the sound of a car passing slowly, then fading away. In the yard, more leaves continued to fall, scattered but steady. Watching them, Eleanor felt lighter, not because of their beauty, but because even simple things like that reminded her that life continues to move in the most ordinary ways. Harper would visit over the weekend. Finn had texted saying he wanted to meet properly and talk. And Mason, she didn't know when he would finally understand, but her waiting had ended. Those who came to her, she would welcome. Those who left, she would let go. Everything had returned to its rightful place. Eleanor murmured to herself, as if summing up all that had happened, respecting elders isn't an obligation, it's character, and sometimes one small gesture can save a family from breaking. She touched the arm of the chair, feeling the familiar texture of the wood. The house was the same, she was the same, but her heart had changed, lighter, clearer. In the gentle breeze, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, looking at her yard as if seeing it for the first time. And before she stood up, she whispered one more sentence, not for anyone in particular, but for anyone who might need to hear it. If you've seen a part of yourself in this story, stay here with me. We still have many things to share. Subscribe so you won't miss the stories ahead. The words were soft as wind, yet enough to keep the listener close, not because of the invitation, but because they knew more warmth waited beyond.